Hello, I'm the Dark Master, and welcome back to the history of Mississippi. In this episode, we'll be discussing the Archaic period. Just like last time, let us start by defining the stage in history. The Archaic stage lasts approximately from 8,000 years BC to 1,000 years BC and saw numerous cultures, which little can be generalized, but are often called the Meso-Indians, and the period is often called the Meso-Indian period. Since the state obviously didn't exist, of course, I will be discussing the overall southeastern area, which had many overlapping cultures and regions at this time. And it was quite a time of change. The last glacial ended, which caused Beringia to flood by rising sea levels, forcing the Indians into isolation from the rest of the world. The megafauna also disappeared, forcing the natives to adapt. At this time, the Kennewick man actually lived. That was a mistake I made in the last episode. I just want to correct it now. The Native Americans adopted in various ways depending on where they lived. In the southeast, they shifted to hunting smaller, more common game such as deer and turkey. They also did subsistence gathering of berries, nuts, and shellfish. Up north, where the Kennewick man lived, he probably would have had a similar diet. In the southeast, several major periods slash cultures lived in the area, including the Mount Taylor period, Stalling Island culture, Poverty Point culture, Norwood culture, and the Orange culture. Before we go into the specifics of each culture, let's describe what life would have been like during this time. The people of the Archaic stage continued to use their Paleolithic arrowheads, but during the middle part of the Archaic stage, they were supplemented by copper knives and spear points. And in general, depending on the culture, they may have practiced some level of farming, but that really doesn't start until the next period, which we'll be discussing next time. Now, let us begin with the Mount Taylor culture, which emerged 5,000 years ago from the regionally undifferentiated Middle Archaic culture and lasted to 2,000 years BCE. While technically from what is now Florida, due to trade routes, it had influence all across the southeast. The Mount Taylor culture was pre-ceramic, meaning it didn't produce pottery. However, despite this glaring omission, this culture is the first to leave a major presence in the continent, aside from, arrowheads. How might they do this without pottery or buildings? Well, they're trash. I'm not joking. We know a lot about the Mount Taylor culture because of their middens, which are large mounds of animal bones and other leftovers associated usually with humans, though octopi can also produce them. The middens have a rather odd composition in the Mount Taylor culture. This culture's middens were overwhelmingly consisted of snail shells. Up to 99% of many of the middens consisted of river or apple snail shells. This surpasses even the French in love of snaily cuisine. Though to be fair, the Mount Taylor culture also consumed freshwater mussels, and on coastal sites, the dominance of snails is a lot more contested, and are often more consisted of oysters, coquinas, and sometimes surf clams. Like all good things, the snail-loving Mount Taylor culture was not to last, however, due to their own overconsumptions of natural resources, which is a theory of why they disappeared slash evolved into the Orange period, which we'll be discussing next. In all, they were a very interesting culture that not only left behind their tastes, but also some of the oldest confirmed burial mounds in that crazy state of Florida, dated at 4,600 to 5,100 years ago. The Orange period slash culture emerged at the end of the Mount Taylor period, approximately 2000 BCE, and lasted to 500 BCE. Unlike their predecessors, they created fiber tempted ceramics, but these were not the first pottery makers. That award goes to the lesser known Stallings Island culture, which created the oldest known pottery, which was understandably simple. The Norwood culture is another little known but important culture in the late Archaic period. Unlike previous lithic cultures, the Norwood culture, in the style typical of later cultures at the time, created triangular shaped projectile points with clear indications of notches for spear shafts. Another development was the use of atales or spear throwers, which increases effectiveness in hunting. The Norwalk culture also saw improvements in pottery making. The Indians of this tribe created tempered pottery with fibers of Spanish moss or palmettos. Now you might be a fellow Mississippian wondering, hey, yuppie, isn't this video supposed to be about the history of Mississippi and not the history of Florida? Well, I'll tell you that the next culture we're discussing is located near the heart of the Delta, Belzoni, Mississippi. It is the Poverty Point culture. Now, despite its unfortunate name, the Poverty Point culture was not poor, either in culturally or in our understanding. Despite not farming, this culture managed to produce one of the oldest complex cultures and possibly the very first tribal culture in the Mississippi Delta and wider present day United States. So take that to all the people who say Mississippi is slow. We were the first sites of major culture. The most famous part of the Poverty Point culture is the massive mounds built as it was one of the first of a series of mound builders in the Americas. Although not the oldest in the United States, they are notable as the first of such sizes. Said earthworks consisted of a central plaza, a large flat open area covering about 37 acres. It is believed to have been the site of public ceremonies, rituals, dances, games, and other community activities. The site has ridges that surround it and large ditches where the dirt was removed to make said ridges, which are unfortunately being destroyed, at least before they were preserved, by ranching. But now they're being preserved, so that's okay. But probably the most notable mounds are a large earthen pyramid that is 50 feet high and 500 feet long, and an even larger bird effigy mound that measures 70 feet high and 640 feet across. Also of note is some unusually deep pits, which are hypothesized to have once held huge wooden posts that served as calendar markers, which were used to measure the sun's shadows as well as tell the seasons. These huge works would have taken decades and many hands to create, with 500 and 1,000 people believed to have lived at Poverty Point. Perhaps even more important than those large monuments are the hundreds of artifacts found in the site, which help give us a level and knowledge on their culture. Plummets fashioned out of iron ore in Arkansas for use as weights in fishnets shows an extensive reach of their alleged trading culture. In fact, many of the raw materials such as slate, copper, galena, jasper, quartz, and soapstone indicate the use of imported materials. This is different from other southeastern cultures, both at the time and later, which relied on local materials more. These materials were used to produce a wealth of artifacts, including animal effigy figures, crude human figures used for religious purposes, simple thick-walled pottery, stone vessels, spear points, adzes, hoes, drills, edge-touched flakes, and blades. Perhaps most interesting are baked loess balls used to prepare meals. Scholars believe dozens of these balls were made in various shapes to control cooking temperature and cooking time. And they were dropped into a bonfire and then dropped into pits containing food to cook them. The poverty point culture also developed a tradition of making high quality, stylized, carved, and polished miniature stone beads. Compared to other Eastern cultures which used softer materials such as shells which decomposed, the beads here have survived in large numbers and depict common animals of the area such as owls, dogs, locusts, and vultures. With the exception of the Mount Taylor period, Stalling Island culture, and Thoms Creek culture, most of the cultures that emerged in the Archaic stage lasted into the next period, which saw the emergence of many of the famous cultures, such as the one that bears the name of the state, the Mississippian culture. And the end of the Archaic period is marked by a very large revolution. That is the development of sedentary farming around 1,000 years ago. Join me next time where we explore this formative time in the history of Mississippi.